Great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, The State of the Sector, New York City Arts and Cultural Landscape Through the Early Stages of the Pandemic. We're so grateful that you have been able to join us this morning. My name is Katie Ingersoll. I'm the Programs Director at SMU Data Arts, and I'm going to get us started with just a few housekeeping notes. We have quite a number of you on this webinar this morning, so all participants will be on mute during today's session, but we do encourage you to use the Q&A feature in Zoom. You can find that at the bottom of your screen, and you can use that Q&A feature to ask any questions you have about the content of today's webinar. We have some folks monitoring that chat throughout the session, so they'll be answering their questions as you put them in, and we'll also take some moments to read some of the questions out loud that are popular. If you see that someone has already asked your question, you can upvote a question, so that will help us recognize if there's something that's coming up for multiple people. We also have the chat feature, which we would encourage you to use to reach out to our team to help troubleshoot any technology issues you may experience, or if we direct you to answer something in the chat so everybody can see it. We do have closed captioning available for today's webinar. If you would like to activate that feature, simply click the CC icon to turn on closed captioning. You'll then be prompted to view closed captions via subtitles or by live transcript. You will also see a subtitle setting tab. You can make adjustments to the size or format of the subtitles. If you need any assistance with this, please go ahead and send our team a chat. And to preempt the question we often get when we start webinars, we are recording this webinar, and we will send you a link that you can review later or share with colleagues who were unable to join us today. So we're very excited with us today. We have some great folks. We have Shirley Levy, Chief of Staff at the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. We have Dr. Zannie Voss, Director of SMU Data Arts, and Dan Gordon, Support Center Manager at SMU Data Arts. I'm now going to turn it over to Shirley to give us a brief welcome.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Shirley Levy. I'm the Chief of Staff at the Department of Cultural Affairs, and I want to welcome you to today's program and conversation. And on behalf of Commissioner Gonzalez, also want to apologize that he can't be here, but as maybe some of you know, he's about to go into testimony. So I'm here in his stead to welcome you and thank you for participating and joining us today. The turnout for this conversation exceeded all of our expectations, although I guess we shouldn't be surprised. I think it really just affirms how deeply concerned everybody is, not just about their individual institutions, but also about us collectively as a sector. And I think for one, I'm definitely looking forward to hearing more from Dr. Voss soon about what we know to be some of the early impacts of the pandemic on the cultural sector. SMU has a very rich data set to pull from, and hopefully will continue to do so into the future. Just a word about data. It tells us a lot about ourselves, but it also at Cultural Affairs helps us shape policy and decisions about funding. Last spring, we partnered with SMU and with AFTA to conduct a survey and release a report around the impacts of COVID on the sector. And through that report, we learned, what we already anecdotally knew, which is that arts education and arts educators were disproportionately impacted in the realm of employment. And that led directly to DCLA's investment in the Arts Educator Emergency Relief Fund, for which applications are currently open. And if you want to find out more about that, you can go to the NYC AIE Roundtable site for more information. I also just want to end with a plug for SMU's cultural data profile. As you know, this is no longer a requirement in our CDF application, but that does not mean in any way that we value the profile any less. And we want to very much encourage you to take advantage of the profile and all the tools that it provides you, because again, without data, it's hard to really understand the full picture of yourself as an organization and how you fit into the sector writ large. And the data makes it possible to have these kinds of conversations like the one we're about to have. So I want to thank you in advance for continuing to participate and for joining us today. And without further ado, I'll turn the floor back to Katie. Thank you.
Great, and I'm going to go ahead and thank you so much, Shirley, for being here today. And I'll go ahead and introduce Zannie Voss to take us through some of the research.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Shirley. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today. I'm going to share a little bit about some early signs that we saw during the pandemic, and then talk a bit about what was the situation heading into it. And then I'll turn the floor back over to Katie. I want to start by looking at impacts of COVID-19 on the arts kind of on a national scale. You can see a quote here from one of the participants in that early after survey in New York. We work closely with an organization called TRG Arts, and they have a COVID-19 sector dashboard. And so it's been doing live feeds throughout the pandemic about purchase and donation data. So I want to share some of those highlights with you. As a partner, we receive all of the TRG data that helps us learn about what's going on with arts consumption. I think it isn't news to anyone here that the New York nonprofit arts and cultural sector has been hard hit by the pandemic and by ongoing systematic racism. It continues to face serious challenges. There's hope on the horizon, right? I share with Shirley, I heard that as of 6 days ago, the state's going to allow limited live performances starting in April. We see here for the TRG data that tickets sold fell 83% and box office income fell 84% from March to September 2020 versus 2019. That's a pretty significant drop. A lot of that was driven by losses in patronage with older ticket buyers, older donors. There's been somewhat of an uptick, which is really great to see with Gen X, with millennials, but we still have a long ways to go before we're back to pre-pandemic levels. At the start of the pandemic, so up until May 8th, we worked with DCLA and with AFTA, as Shirley had mentioned. And at that time, 95% of New York organizations had canceled some programs and 88% had modified delivery of programs. We expect that, of course, to have changed pretty dramatically since then. But I know that many of you have continued to serve your communities and provided resources to employees in other ways. We see, in addition, that reported for so this was in November of 2020, reported for advance sales, the period December 1st, 2020 through August 31st, 2021. Advance tickets were 67% and revenues 89% of the levels that they were the prior year. So not only was it looking at, because doors were closed, sales weren't happening for the present moment, people were really uncertain and hesitant to make purchases for the future, which of course has a lot of implications for revenue. In attendance, we know from Colleen Dillon Schneider, attendance is not projected to return to 2019 levels until at least 2022. When we look at donations, the TRG data is showing that people are making more gifts, but a lower average amount. So compared to 2019, the number of gifts actually rose by 2015 and 2020, but the aggregate revenue per gift fell 13%. So 3 out of 4 organizations received more gifts in 2020 than in 2019. And actually, they were seeing an increase in donations made per month up until September, when that started going down. There was a bump in December with kind of end of year giving, and it remains to be seen what's going to transpire moving forward, if we'll be able to keep that momentum going. The average was lower, and if you dig a little deeper, TRG has found that the big drop is coming in the biggest gifts, that most of the overall 13% drop in aggregate revenue was actually due to a reduction of almost $43 million year over year in gifts of over $1 million. Looking specifically at the data that was collected through the AFTA survey by DCLA in early May and in April, here's what we were already seeing with respect to finances. Aggregate revenue loss had already totaled over $500 million. And 11% of organizations at that time were not confident they'd survive the pandemic, half of which had a budget under $250,000. As Shirley mentioned, arts education organizations experienced the most severe income losses, 18%, followed closely by performing arts organizations at 17%. And small organizations, those with a budget under $100,000, were suffering the highest percentage losses in operating revenue. And I want to highlight the quote over on the left from the executive director of a small music organization, looking at being flexible. A big factor was having little overhead as possible. You only fix expenses a small salary. When your programs collapse, all of your expenses collapse as well. So many of the small organizations, even though they had the highest operating revenue loss, they were also the most nimble because they didn't have such a high level of fixed costs. So they had greater savings. And I want to kind of touch on this for a moment. An organization's stability through the pandemic may be partially attributable to its financial starting place heading into the pandemic. There's a professor and an author at NYU Stern School of Business, Scott Galloway, and in his book, he's called the pandemic kind of the great acceleration, that whatever trend you were experiencing pre-pandemic, good or bad, it's now kind of 10 years ahead of schedule. So a decade, which is all packed into just a period of several months. So it's important to understand what was the trajectory heading into the pandemic, because we think it says a lot about what an organization's current state is, as well as what is going to be the right path forward. And this brings us to a not terribly sexy, but a critically important element of financial stability, which is working capital, or ready access to flexible cash. It's, among other things, a buffer against uncertainty. So we would look at what was it heading into the crisis. So what is working capital? It's a measure of liquidity. It represents an organization's unrestricted resources available to meet day-to-day obligations, or again, ready access to available cash. I want to do a quick chat storm. So if you could go to the chat, and on the count of 3, what's your answer to these 2 questions? Has your organization ever been cash strapped? And in a word, what did that feel like? I'm seeing the responses start coming in. I know that I've run organizations before that have been cash strapped, and it is really kind of a scary moment. You know, if your organization has ever experienced this, then you know probably more than you ever wanted to know about the importance of working capital. So while few leaders wake up with excitement over working capital management, we all know what it's like to lose sleep over it. When we look at calculating it, we're going to look at unrestricted current assets less current liabilities. So this excludes all restricted and invested funds, but it includes all forms of savings held in cash. So organizations have to run unrestricted surpluses in order to increase working capital. You know, you can have different calculations. This is really the most straightforward. And I also want to share with you this notion of months of working capital. It's a useful metric that shows how long an organization can survive at its current expense size in the absence of revenue. It declines when organizations either run deficits or when their expenses grow, but the level of liquidity doesn't grow. And so here's what we want to look at. And just to kind of drive home the point of what's working capital, here's the why does it matter? I'm going to be sharing with you some quotes from some research that we've conducted with Wallace Foundation into high-performing arts organizations of color. We had the pleasure of speaking with leaders of 21 arts organizations of color around the country who kind of said in their own words, what are the different elements that have driven them to be fiscally stable. And it's a paper that's going to come out tomorrow, actually, but you'll see this kind of peppered in some of these quotes because they really resonate with a lot of these concepts. One said, liquidity, like cash flow, it sounds simplistic, but it lets you dream big and really think ahead about strategic growth, which you can't do if you can't turn the lights on. It relieves the not sleeping at night issue. It lets you get beyond basic needs. It's where resiliency begins. I love this quote. So some research, some findings that I want to share with you. We're going to ask questions about from 2016 to 2019, so heading into the pandemic, when the economy was strong, did arts organizations take actions to build liquidity to levels that could buffer the storm brought on by a pandemic? And to do that, we're going to turn to the CDP data. So a huge thank you to all of those who have submitted data, who have provided data for this period. We're going to look at both mean or average and median, which is kind of the midpoint in a range among all survey respondents, for working capital trends for over 1,000 organizations that completed it every year from 2016 to 2019, and a subset of 158 organizations in New York relative to the national cohort. And what we see, a finding, is that most arts and cultural groups across the country actually had inadequate working capital. So the median was only 1.5 months heading into the pandemic. It's the same level as was the case in 2016. So this is 2019, when the economy was good. In a Goldilocks economy, most organizations still only have 1.5 months of working capital. Now the average was 5, but it's really skewed high by a number of large, very large levels of working capital concentrated among a few organizations. So we're instead going to really focus on the median, which is, again, is kind of the normal or midpoint that most organizations experienced. During this period, we know from the data that most organizations ended their fiscal years near the break-even point. And so they didn't achieve surpluses, so they didn't have anything to squirrel away. And if we break it down further, we'll see that while working capital did rise for some organizations, actually 47% of organizations had fewer months of working capital in 2019 than they did in 2016. And for a lot of others, it remained virtually unchanged. So I want you to think about, what was your own organization's trend? What was your story heading into this pandemic? I'm going to look now at New York organizations by comparison. So think again, 1.5 median, 5 months of working capital. This is overall nationally. Among New York organizations, median working capital was actually slightly higher than average. So median higher than average rather than the reverse, meaning that probably among some large organizations, there was actually negative working capital, bringing it down. The average, though, if you go right back and look at what it was for across the country, average was actually quite a bit lower. So median working capital among New York organizations was actually healthier than looking at the country as a whole. That's pretty exciting. What about the trends? We see that New York organizations' liquidity had steadily improved in recent years at a greater rate relative to other markets. So when we look at average months of working capital, we see that overall, and for New York was starting to really turn the tide in terms of working capital stability. I want to look at another question, and this is from a white paper that will come out later this week or early next week, and it's called Buffering Against Uncertainty, Working Capital and the Resiliency of BIPOC Serving Arts Organizations. It's some research that we've done with Rebecca Thomas of Rebecca Thomas and Associates, who's really fantastic. Great pleasure to be working with her. And we asked the question, well, how well prepared were arts organizations that primarily serve Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities through their mission-related work compared to their non-BIPOC peers who don't self-identify as primarily serving a community of color? So we did a similar analysis, breaking organizations into BIPOC and non-BIPOC, both nationally as well as within New York City. And we did this in part because we know that this public health crisis has exacerbated really deep divisions within American society. Communities of color have disproportionately been affected by COVID infection and COVID mortality. And when we went back and looked at even the early DCLA and AFTA survey that we did, almost 10% of those organizations say that they primarily serve people of color. So it's really important to examine impact on the organizational health. That's really key to making these organizations and the communities that they serve healthy, and looking at a multi-pronged process here. What we saw was that BIPOC serving organizations in New York City were actually more liquid than their non-BIPOC peers. They had more months of working capital, 3 relative to 2.2. And they also had higher levels of working capital than their peers in other markets. So huge shout out to the liquidity of arts organizations primarily serving communities of color in New York City. The liquidity was particularly strong. We saw, if you break it down further nationally, we didn't have enough organizations in New York City to really do this analysis quite yet. We're hoping that we can have more data from 2019 and 2020 to dig into this deeper in New York. But we have seen, if you look at the overall pool, that months of median working capital, actually the gap increases with organizational size. So all of the organizations had about 3 months of working capital for organizations that were small budget. But as organizations increased in size, it was actually the BIPOC serving organizations that had higher levels of liquidity than their peers. And that kind of made us ask the question, if organizations of color have an equitable access to revenue and capital, as we hear in our own research and from other studies, why are they more liquid? One reason is that, well, let's take a 30,000-foot look back and say, we know that arts and cultural organizations that primarily serve communities of color tend to be operating in arts and cultural sectors that have smaller budgets. And when we look, small organizations of all kinds tend to be more liquid than larger ones. You can see median trends consistently. Small organizations had more liquidity. Generally, this is true because they have more flexible operating structures that we had seen earlier in that quote. They have adaptive capabilities. They are nimble. They can change. When revenue doesn't come as expected, they have more of an ability to cut costs. However, they often rely on sweat equity, low cost of free space, volunteered, contracted workers. All of this means that they're more readily to adjust to achieve surpluses, but it also means capacity constraints, right? Which brings us to a next point. BIPOC serving arts organizations are less likely to grow. They tend to be smaller than their non-BIPOC counterparts at every size grouping. And maybe some of you, as I was presenting these findings, were saying, wait a minute, we primarily serve a community of color, and you're saying, oh, you've got all this liquidity, you're healthy, everything's fine, but it sure doesn't feel that way. Well, BIPOC organizations are often under-resourced in a broader sense, even when their financials show more cash. The interviews brought to light challenges faced by organizations of color that really deserve highlighting and attention. Commonly identified external hurdles unique to these organizations were racism, gentrification, and lack of access to funding, which some see as kind of, in totality, elements of a white supremacy culture. Interviews noted that when organizations of color seek to grow and they serve low-income communities, their ability to expand and to grow is, number one, somewhat constrained by a community base that may be low income and doesn't have the means itself to generate more earned revenue or individual contributions, and they face lack of access to corporate and foundation funding at levels that are equitable to those provided to their peers that don't primarily serve communities of color. Some quotes, we heard Eurocentric organizations get buildings and resources, organizations of color don't. Everyone's running out trying to find a ghetto to serve to get the EDI money. It takes away from the organizations that have always done this work and will be there forever. We should all be treated equitably, but that isn't the case. Additionally, BIPOC organizations frequently don't have access to equitable access to cash, to banking relationships, lines of credit, bank loans, earlier on in the pandemic, access to the PPP funds. Due to policies and practices that reflect structural racism in a broader sense in society. So the absence of access to capital, access to revenue, it appears to perpetuate critical organizational capacity shortages. In interviews, leaders of financially stable BIPOC organizations repeatedly identified their top challenge as low compensation levels and insufficient organizational capacity, or people, the ability to people to serve more people. This in turn leads to difficulty recruiting high caliber talent and burnout for those who stay. And so leaders we interviewed recognized the importance of investing more in professional marketing and fundraising staff who can then generate higher levels of revenue, but they simply frequently don't have the bandwidth and the resources to do so. Lastly, despite inequitable access to revenue and capital, BIPOC serving groups tend to have a strong track record of living within their means and profound relevance to the communities they serve. We heard when you build community with a group of people that have been historically underrepresented, it builds a lot of loyalty. Organizations rooted in their community are very valued because it's where people find their people. I don't believe there's another way to achieve healthy bottom line than through success and being meaningful to the community. And I love this. Every year we put away money. If you eat all your rice today, you'll have none for tomorrow. Always keep rice in your pot. Organizations who we interviewed have a firm dedication to staying within their means, discipline to stay within their means, and that really contradicts any kind of historical perceptions or racial biases that BIPOC serving organizations are more of a funding risk just because they're small. In summary, these organizations receive less of the revenue pie, so they're more likely to remain small. It means that they can take decisive actions and be nimble so they can build some savings, and yet growth is not a universal ambition. But for those who want to grow, equitable access to revenue and capital means that many of these organizations that want to grow are denied agency. So here I want to think about moving forward, fostering resiliency with some recommendations, both to grant makers as well as to arts and cultural organizations. And again, this is recommendations you'll find in the paper that we've done with Rebecca. First, support recovery, reimagining, and rebuilding. We strongly encourage funders of all sorts to support grantee-defined strategies for recovery and adaptation. place big bets on organizations whose communities have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic and may have recovery needs that actually measure in decades. Invest in capacity building. Provide flexible multi-year capacity building funds for staff positions and salaries so that organizations can address those gaps in human capital. So before encouraging organizations to start adding programming, think first about how do you help them to add staff to support the programming that's currently in place before adding new programs and just getting to a faster level of burnout. Reinforce new business models. As organizations emerge from the pandemic changed or smaller, they're going to need a mix of flexible support. So signal trust in grantees by making unrestricted grants for longer periods of time, understanding that this long period actually may be a longer runway, a longer horizon than is typical for a multi-year grant. And lastly, help prevent history from repeating itself. The pandemic represents for grant makers an opportunity to support cash reserves in addition to funding strong programmings. Funders who are working towards equity with BIPOC organizations should specifically and intentionally consider adding reserve funds to their operating grants. For organizations, know your financial risks. Can you afford a deficit this year? If so, how are you going to cover it? Prepare a monthly forecast of predicted versus actual cash receipts versus expenditures for the year to come. It's a simple tool that you can make for yourself that will help to reduce monthly cash burn and extend stability. Develop scenarios, do scenario planning. AEA Consulting with Wallace offered free scenario planning toolkit. When you think about scenarios, you don't need tons of them, just come up with 2. To reopen, consider how much cash are you going to need before earned revenue streams begin. Adjust the timeline of your recovery plans given what is your access to funds. Plan to redo your plans. Uncertainty is a given. Monitor your results regularly. Have a plan B and be ready to execute on it. Reforecast as soon as you know you need to. And lastly, start setting savings goals now. I know it may not feel like this is the right time, but start thinking ahead. Talk to your board, discuss realistic savings plans with your staff. Prioritize rebuilding cash to cover several months of operations, possibly at a reduced size. For example, if your goal is eventually to get to 3 months of working capital, then budget for the next 3 years, 1 additional month's worth of expenses as surplus. And with that, I'm going to just kind of share with you these reports. As I said, the Buffering Against Uncertainty is going to be coming out either later this week or early next week. There's also the report that we did with Rebecca Thomas called 5 Steps to Healthy Working Capital, just with some really practical advice for organizations that want to think about being prepared financially so that you can buffer uncertainty should there be another crisis. And I want to thank sincerely all of you who have contributed your data and your time over the years to this effort. Your data helps us to provide these insights that we hope will lift up the entire field. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Katie.
Great. Thank you, Zannie. We do have a couple of questions, so maybe we can pause for a second and just more good discussion items, I think. So just that you can maybe talk a little bit about. So Piper Gunnarsson asked, one thing that can be frustrating is funders are not interested in supporting the establishment or development of working capital or reserve funds. And I know you mentioned this a little bit in the recommendations to grant makers, but the question is, what can we do to motivate them to support this? Do you want to comment on that?
I would encourage, we're hopeful that these findings will inspire grant makers to take this seriously. When times are good, people aren't really paying attention much to working capital, but organizations that didn't have it heading into this crisis, I'm sure felt an incredible amount of pain and uncertainty and anxiety. So thinking about in applications, how can you make your own plans for cash reserves? How can you make that part of what you're requesting from grant makers? Even if it's a grant maker who's asking for applications for general operating support, how can you articulate the importance to your organization of making sure that you're planning for the future? Having some working capital helps you to also take some of the artistic risks without jeopardizing the future of the organization. This isn't about just having money for the sake of money. It's allowing the organization room to dream. And I think that ability to want to dream is something that grant makers will be responsive to, more so than thinking about it just in terms of, can we have cash for our cash reserves?
Absolutely. Thanks, Zannie. And then I think another kind of great question for discussion for all of us. You mentioned the perception that BIPOC serving organizations can be a risk for investment. And there's a question of how can we overcome that perception?
Again, we do this research, we share these findings to try and shine a light on something that may seem to be counterintuitive. We hope to dispel myths. I think as organizations have this kind of context through data, there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all answer to what does health look like. It really does depend on context. And I think it's critically important for organizations of color to have voice to step up and say, what is context? And part of it now is you will have this report to turn to show to funders that no, actually, we're quite normal, and it's not unusual for organizations of color to have more stable capital. One thing I didn't mention is BIPOC organizations actually tended to have higher surpluses over the last 4 years. And you'll see that when we publish the reports. And that was measured not only in terms of unrestricted surplus, but also operating surplus before and after depreciation. There's a lot of incredible work and an amount of incredible discipline that has to be celebrated. I think that organizations of color have an awful lot to teach actually the rest of the field. And it's time we start doing that.
Great, thanks, Zannie. And there are a number of questions about how to get access to some of the reports that Zannie mentioned. So we will put, as Zannie said, we have a report coming out tomorrow, which we will put in the follow-up email to this webinar. And we can also include a link to the 5 steps to working capital report that Zannie mentioned. And then the report that Zannie was discussing about resiliency and working capital for BIPOC organizations is going to be coming out at the end of the week. And so one of our staff members is going to put in the chat our link to sign up to our quarterly newsletter. And that's also the link that's the list that we use to announce new research projects. So I would encourage all of you to sign up for that so that you can hear about any new research that's coming out as it happens. Great. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and switch gears, and I'm going to share my screen. And I did see a question in the chat about, how many arts organizations this year have had to stop paying themselves and had to go all volunteer, which is a really excellent question. And to get to that, I do kind of want to transition and just thinking about, what we've all seen over the last year. I think we've learned that over this last year that if anything is true, it's that change is going to be a constant in our lives and the way that we manage our organizations, and good longitudinal data on the arts sector through this crisis is essential in how we can understand how to weather future periods of upheaval. It's also important for advocacy efforts, as we've been discussing. How do we make these stories, the kind that Zannie was highlighting, clear to grant makers and to our other organizations in the field? And so we wanted to bring you here today to kind of share this research with you in the hopes that it will be useful to you as you manage through this crisis, but also to make the case for extending this data set through 2020. So the research that Zannie just shared, of course, ends in 2019 because that is the data that we have available in the CDP. And so we're going to be talking today about how we can gather more data for 2020 so that we can understand how the story that Zannie began to lay out is continuing. And so that brings us to our discussion of the cultural data profile. That's the data collection tool that enables the research that Zannie just shared. And I know many of you in New York City are very familiar with the CDP. You've been contributing your data to this resource as part of your grant application for many years. But this year, as Shirley mentioned, the CDP will not be required as part of the Department of Cultural Affairs grant application. So many of you have a choice on whether you'll fill out the CDP or not. And so what we're here today to talk with you about is what you might weigh as you're making that choice of whether to contribute and enter your data. So we're very grateful to the Department of Cultural Affairs for facilitating this conversation today so we can talk with you about that. We know that the decision whether to put your data into the CDP is going to be affected by the ways your data is used for research, like we just looked at, the benefits that your organization individually gets from having your data in the system, and also what the process of data entry is like. So I'm going to talk about all of these things briefly in our remaining time today. So first, Let's take a quick walkthrough on how we're able to provide the insights to the field, like those that Zannie just shared and the ones in our other research reports. So it obviously starts with the data that you're entering into the cultural data profile. For those of you who are not familiar with the CDP, it collects end-of-year data on your organization's finances, staffing, and programs. Now, as more and more organizations participate, our data set becomes richer, and our research team also connects your data to other sources like 990 data, census data, and data about ticketing to create a model of the entire arts sector that helps us answer some of these questions. And this data that we have enables the sector-wide research and the tools that we provide. So Zannie shared some research, and here are a few snapshots of other recent research. I'm going to highlight a few. The Earned Revenue Report is a look at earned revenue trends within the sector. We refresh this report and others like it regularly to kind of keep up with sector trends in key operational areas. In It for the Long Haul is something that Zannie also referenced. It's a piece of research that was released at the beginning of the pandemic, discussing the potential impact of the crisis and considerations for organizations as they move forward. And the Alchemy of High-Performing Arts Organizations is a study where our researchers identified organizations that were performing above expectations or had successfully executed a turnaround that was also using CDP data, and then interviewed those leaders from organizations to better understand what decisions and practices led to those results. What was the alchemy that leads to high performance? We are about to release a follow-up study this week, tomorrow actually, that focuses on BIPOC organizations that Zannie mentioned. In addition to field-wide research, we also have resources available that help you utilize your organization's data, including our analytic reports. So the analytic reports calculate many of the same data points and metrics explored in our research, but just for your organization. Our analytic reports fall into 3 categories: annual, trend, and comparison. The annual report provides a summary of your organization's financial activity, program activity, staffing data, and attendance. This report can be a valuable communication tool, helping you provide staff, board members, and external stakeholders with a strong overview of your organization. The trend reports analyze changes in your data year to year and help you understand how internal decisions and changes in your surrounding environment, which we've had many of this year, how those things have affected your finances and operations over time. Finally, comparison reports allow you to compare your organization against a group of peers that you create by selecting criteria. So this type of benchmarking can be really essential for understanding how to grow, how to increase financial sustainability and achieve the working capital goals that Zannie just mentioned, or to achieve other goals that your organization has set. Understanding what are the differences between you and your peers can really help with that kind of planning. Both the trend and comparison reports are offered in 6 different formats that highlight different topics. So you'll find reports on your financial health, marketing, fundraising, staffing, and your programming. So I'm going to give you a quick peek at just one of these reports, the fundraising comparison report. So since this is a comparison report, for each row of data, the first column will show information for your organization. And then there'll be 2 columns that display the median and the average for your comparison group. And remember that that comparison group you will craft using a range of criteria, such as geography, discipline, or budget size. The top section of this report, again, it's focused on fundraising. So it includes some high-level totals related to fundraising, your total fundraising expenses, and your total contributed revenue. Next section shows metrics that are calculated from your data, as well as the comparison group. These metrics can help you think about return on investment for fundraising in different ways. So one example, here we have calculated how much was raised for each dollar spent on fundraising, which just helps you think about what you're getting back from your investment in this area. These different metrics are then visualized in a graph below. And finally, a chart at the bottom of the page shows contributions, number of contributors, and average contribution size by source, and also allows you to compare these numbers to your peer organizations to see where there may be differences between you and your peers in this area. So this is just one example of a report that focuses on fundraising and helps you maybe think about your fundraising goals. We have similar reports for other topics like staffing, marketing, working capital, and financial topics. So those are the analytic reports. The next research I will share is the KPI Dashboard. KPI stands for Key and Tangible Performance Indicators. And this is a dashboard that provides benchmarking scores from 1 to 100 on 24 key performance indicators for your organization. So again, these are some of the same key metrics that you'll see in the research that Zannie was sharing, like working capital, or throughout the reports we just looked at, the analytic reports. So the KPI dashboard also provides what we consider and talk about as a level playing field. So what does that mean? Before scores are assigned to your organization, our researchers control for factors in your environment or about your organization that are likely to drive those scores. Let's take a closer look at this dashboard. So here's the main page of the KPI dashboard. So each colored dot is one of those 24 indicators that I mentioned. So you can choose different areas to delve into, and the color codes here kind of signify your organization's scores. Now, as you start to look at specific indicators, again, you'll see a score between 1 and 100. These are percentiles. So, if you have a score of a 50, that means you're right in the middle of where we'd expect you to be based on who you are and how you operate. Now, if you look at these, we're in the fundraising section, so you'll recognize some similar metrics that we saw in the fundraising comparison report, including return on fundraising. We also have different metrics that delve into each of those different types of or sources of contributions that we saw in the previous report. Now, I mentioned before that the dashboard provides a level playing field. I want to talk about that for one more minute, just to really delve into that concept. Our research team has used all of that data that we talked about at the beginning to understand how certain factors that we can measure affect organizational performance on these indicators. So those things that we can measure might include things about your local funding environment, how many other organizations exist in your area that you might be competing with to access the same funding, information about your organization's age or the specific sector you're in, or demographic information about your community. And so once our researchers know how those different factors tend to affect performance on these different indicators, they can control for those effects before they assign your scores. So what that means is once you control for all those things that I mentioned that you can measure, your scores here are going to reflect the result of what we call intangibles, things that are really hard to measure. So those might be things like community relationships, organizational culture, or brand trust. Zannie always likes to say that this is the mojo that allows organizations to thrive, which I do love that phrase. We also have some examples here that come from our recent research on the alchemy of high-performing arts organizations. So again, this dashboard can be a really great way to help your organization think about what's going really right with your organization. Where is that alchemy coming together? And also, are there any places where you might grow? So how to use all these tools at your organization. So they can be helpful to frame conversations with board and staff about your past performance. We really recommend touring the KPI dashboard with a group. So maybe get together your senior staff, get together your board. If you have a small staff, just gather everybody in one Zoom call and take a look at that KPI dashboard and facilitate a conversation about areas of strength that you want to celebrate and also areas where you may want to focus for growth. The analytic reports in the KPI dashboard can also be an important part of strategic planning. So if you do decide to enter data through fiscal year 2020, again, you'll have those trend reports to really help you take a moment to take stock of the decisions and trade-offs that we've all made as organizations to make it through this crisis and see what might that mean for your organization moving forward. Finally, they can be a great tool for communicating with stakeholders. So you can access formative reports to share with supporters and donors without necessarily spending additional time each time you need a report. Great. So if the last year has shown us anything, it's that it's more important than ever to have solid information about your organization and the sector to help carry us forward. We've seen a lot of examples today from Zannie and what I just shared of how data can help your organization. At the same time, we know that organizational resources are more constrained than ever, and these benefits need to be balanced with capacity at your organization. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit to talking about some of the changes that we've made to help preserve organizational capacity. So the first is survey streamline. In December, we made some changes to the CDP to shorten every section and reduce the amount of detail required in the survey. So while every section was reduced in some way, and I'm not going to walk through the entire new survey, but we do have resources available if you'd like to learn more. The biggest reduction that we made was in the expenses section, which went from 37 lines down to 17. To make these changes, our research team examined which data points were essential to the research and the resources that we just looked through, And that was what was left, right? So anything that was really essential to helping organizations understand their operations and the research we provide, everything else we took away, and that formed the basis of the streamline profile. We then shared that profile for multiple rounds of feedback to get on the new format over the course of the last year. For those of you who have historic data that you've entered in the cultural data profile, we have transformed all of your historic existing data to match this new format. So you can still use all that data to analyze trends over time. You can find more information about the new survey, as well as a copy of that new survey in a PDF or Excel format that you can take a look at the link on your screen, and we can include that in the follow-up email. I'm very excited about this. This is something that is new that we're trying and we're introducing today. This is specifically for small organizations and BIPOC organizations. And so we want to make sure that organizations are represented in our data set, but we know that those organizations particularly may have the least capacity to enter data. I know many of you are familiar with our support center staff pictured here. You know them to be a great resource when completing your CDP in the past, but with this new project, our support center staff will step into the role of data entry for you. And so this is a new service. We're starting a pilot, which we're announcing today with small organizations in New York City. And I'm now going to turn it over to Dan Gordon, our support center manager, to tell us a little bit more about this pilot.
Good morning, and thank you, Katie, so much. And thank you to Zannie and Shirley and everyone who is on the webinar this morning. I'm here to introduce the data entry service pilot program that connects organizations with a trained specialist to enter data into the CDP survey on their behalf. Why is this great? Huge time savings, okay? Participating orgs won't enter any data into the website. All that they would need to do is to have an individual account, which many organizations already have. Accuracy, the specialists at DataArts have a ton of experience entering data, and that may result in better translation from documentation to the CDP survey. Analytics, of course, you get the same access to all of our benefits of participation, like analytic tools and the KPI Dashboard. And lastly, the capture of data through this unique period of time when analyzed can support future research about organizational decision-making in ways that we can't really predict. Let's see. Okay. Yes. This program is open to organizations in New York City with annual expenses under $250K. This is the required audit threshold for New York State. So we wanted to be underneath of that to represent small organizations. We're taking 25 organizations in this first round between March 10th and April 30th, and then more throughout the summer. And it's first come, first served. When you see the materials, if you are interested, you'll send a form to us. But I also want to say that when we look to start future phases or to open, or if there's spaces that we need to fill in different phases, we're going to start with organizations who have completed the first 2 steps of the process. And that means it would be just telling us that you're interested and then setting your data documentation. So please do not be discouraged if you do say you're interested and you're not in the first phase. We are hoping to have at least 200 organizations data entered. So we're going to try not to leave anyone behind. And on to the next slide. Thank you, Katie. So how do you participate? It's pretty easy. We're going to give you a link in the follow-up email where you'll go to our main landing page. And from there, you're just going to sign up and tell us that you're interested. There's just a very quick form to fill out that says, hey, I'd like to be in the data entry service program. Then you will send your financial documentation to us. This can be hard. You know, like one of the beautiful things about the program is that we're taking half of the burden off, right? We still need to have that data sent to us so that we can get it entered, but we're going to do all the work in the survey. And at this time, if you have only up to 2018 in the CDP profile as a current user, we'd like for you to send us both 2019 fiscal year and your 2020 at the same time. We'll get them both entered for you. If you have 2019 already, please just send us 2020. And if you're new, we'll take 19 and 20 if you have them. That would be just so wonderful. The third step is that we're going to have, once we get that data from you, we'll have a brief kickoff call where we'll just talk to you about that data, fill in any missing pieces. And then once we have everything together, we go away, we enter your data. And when it's done, we reach back out and say, hey, it's time to just do a quick review of your data and have a wrap up where you will kind of sign on and just say, do the complete, and you will complete the survey right there on the site on a phone call. That's the essential parts of the program. We hope that you are interested and go to take a look at our main page and see some of the details. Hope to see you soon. And I'm going to just send it right back on to Katie. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dan. Yeah, so I do see a couple of questions in the chat. So I think we'll start to take questions. So if you have other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I did just put a link to a landing page where you can find out more information about this program that Dan is describing, and you can also sign up from that page. And again, we'll send out the link to sign up in the follow-up email that will go out tomorrow. Someone did ask if they could pay us to pay one of our specialists to fill out the data profile for them. So I just want to clarify that this is a free program, so you do not need to pay to participate, but we're going to need to take it in pieces, right? We hope that we'll have 200 people who want to fill out their data right away, but we will kind of be going a few organizations at a time. So we definitely encourage you to sign up, and you don't need to pay if you're under $250,000 in annual expenses. I also got a question about if it's $250,000 with or without in-kind contributions. So I think if you're under 250K without in-kind contributions. But if you have any questions about that, reach out to us. We did choose this number because it does coincide with the audit threshold for New York State, and we think it will be better to sort of work with organizations who have similar types of financial documents in stages. So if you have any questions about whether this is a good program for you, you can also just reach out to our support center for more information. Great. I'll take a look and see what other questions we have received. I did see a question that said they're curious to know how organizations with working capital used reserves during a pandemic. Did folks drain their savings? Did they use a percentage of it, or did they not use it at all? And I'm going to actually kick that over to Zannie, because I think the answer is that we maybe don't know right now, but hopefully that's the kind of thing we can start to answer as we get 2020 data.
Yeah, thanks, Katie, and thank you for the question. All I can share is what I have heard anecdotally, but to really be able to fully answer the question, we can't do it without the data. And our hope is that as organizations enter it, we'll be able to actually describe what happened to finances, what happened to operations during this point in time, so that you can point to those figures in examining your own organization's performance and how it weathered the storm. What we've heard anecdotally is that organizations, by and large, if they had higher fixed costs, they've burned through their working capital. They've burned through what they've had. Whereas if organizations had less fixed costs and were able to just kind of shut down aspects of their operation and hibernate more, then they were able to retain their working capital. It's interesting to see. I went back and I looked through the chat storm, and there are a good number of organizations who, talked about still having cash reserves, still talked about, yeah, we're okay. We've always had some cash. I would encourage you to go back and to point out to some of those peers and say, hey, how did you do it? What kinds of decisions did you and your board make that have allowed you to stay this liquid in such a difficult time? Some organizations have been able to benefit from the PPP funds. Hopefully there'll be more forthcoming very soon from the relief, the current relief package. It's those kinds of exceptional moments and exceptional grant programs that have helped a lot of organizations, not just in New York, but throughout the country. The funding community has been really remarkable in many respects to stepping up and helping organizations to remain sustainable.
Great, thank you, Zannie. Great, and then there is also some questions about, how the research that Zannie shared, if it will be shared with grant makers as well. And I will say yes. We have many grant makers who read our research, and we do make an effort to push out the insights that we find to all of everyone who's working in the cultural sector. And so we do hope that this research can be a tool for advocacy for everyone and something that everyone in the sector can learn from.
I do want to offer that, even though we don't do one-on-one consulting with arts organizations, we're a research organization rather than a consultant. There are fantastic consultants like Rebecca Thomas with Rebecca Thomas and Associates for organizations who need help thinking about how do I start down this path to stability. We have recommendations in the 5 Steps to Healthier Working Capital report, but there are others out there who, do have the capacity, and their business is to work with organizations and get them to a more stable place.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm seeing if there is.
I'm seeing some shout outs for Rebecca Thomas. She's fantastic.
Yeah. Okay. I have a question about thoughts on the SVO grant from the SBA. I don't know if that's something that we have any information on.
It seems to be changing somewhat daily. I would encourage you to check out Americans for the Arts. Quite honestly, I'm not sure where it ended up at the end of yesterday, that there had been a lot of kind of back and forth between an organization could either apply for PPP funds or the venue operators grants, but not both. So I don't want to give wrong information. I would encourage you to keep keeping a finger on the pulse of what's going on AFTA's site. They're great for advocacy information.
Great. And then I think this is a great question and something for us to think about now and also in the future, but are there any resources of new business model options to consider? So I know, yeah, I think we can discuss that a little bit, and it's also a great thing for us to keep thinking about.
Certainly. We've heard from so many organizations, and I'm sure many of you here have experienced this as well. Speaking of that Scott Galloway book, that organizations that had some experience with providing some programming in a digital space before the pandemic have probably seen that trend accelerate dramatically. Others have kind of had to get into that realm and gain the experience during the pandemic. Regardless, if you've seen an appetite built for the digital programming, there's a lot of talk now about, well, how do you put that genie back in the box? Or are organizations going to continue to complement in-person programming with digital programming? What does it mean for, thinking about organizational capacity? I'm not advocating that organizations just keep adding programming and programming and programming without the ability to add staff and to add resources to support it. So, how do you manage those tensions as an organization, serving the local community deeply and starting to serve new audiences from around the world?
Great. Okay. Well, I think that brings us to time. So I just want to I see a few questions about follow-up. So I just want to reiterate that we will be sending a recording of today's session, as well as links to some of the research that was mentioned and a link to sign up if you are an organization in New York City under 250K in annual expenses for that pilot. And if you have any other questions about anything that came up today, you'll see our information for our support center here. So you can always reach out to us and our support center will get you an answer, or we'll connect you with someone who can provide an answer. So again, thank you everyone so much. We're so appreciative of you taking the time today. And we also are really excited to start to see some of your 2020 data so that we can answer some of these really important questions about what's been happening that we've all been through over the last year.
And a huge thank you to Shirley and the team at DCLA for providing us with this opportunity and for their long-term partnership. It's thanks to them and thanks to all of you that we're able to tell these stories.
Thank you. Looking forward.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, everyone.